My name is Sean Meehan and I'm an ecologist, and I'm doing a bat-related survey project on behalf of Leitrim County Council. And we're here today in Ballinamore, beside the Shannon waterway here, and it's a really good habitat for bats. So as you can see, you've got the waterway here behind us, lots of vegetation, the old bridge over here as well, and we're hoping that we will get to see some bat activity later on. Well, in Ireland we have 9 resident bat species. Now some of them are quite rare, but here in County Leitrim on a good night of bat surveying you'd probably pick up about maybe 4 or 5 of the more common species. And the more common species would be the pipistrelles, both the common and the soprano pipistrelle. You'd also get the Leisler bat, and because we're here beside the waterway, I'm hoping that we might get some Dob Enton's bats later on, and they're a bat that specialises in hunting and feeding over waterways. Now, as I said, there's 9 species of bat in Ireland, and in fact they represent about 1/4 of our total mammal species in the country. And that's the important thing about bats, that they are actually mammals. So they are warm-blooded, they give birth to live young, the female produces milk to feed the young, they've got fur on their bodies, and indeed bats, they're the only species of mammal that are capable of true and sustained flight. So that makes them rather unique among the mammals. And bats, I mean, we associate bats with nighttime, and that is true. They are nocturnal species, and the reason they're nocturnal is that they have evolved to, I suppose, occupy that niche of hunting at night when their food prey such as insects and moths is available, but it's also probably a strategy to avoid predation as well. I always get asked a number of different questions. The first one I often get asked is, are bats blind? Well, they're not blind. Their vision is as good as humans, but again, because they are nocturnal species, they don't rely on their vision for hunting and commuting around, and I'll talk a little bit about how they do that in a minute or two. Another myth about bats is that they'll get caught in long hair. Well, bats are extremely agile when they're moving around at night, and using their echolocation, they rarely collide with any obstacles or structures. So if there is a bat flying around close to you, it's very aware that you're there, and it's not going to collide with you or get tangled in your hair. And another thing about bats is they're not actually flying mice as such. They're not rodents, and bats belong to their own group of mammals, the Chiropteras, which comes from the old Greek name for winged hand and wing, which is a very good, I suppose, description of bats. Bats use echolocation to find their way around the landscape, and remember, because they are nocturnal, they are flying around in darkness. So what echolocation is that the bats are emitting hundreds of high-pitched sounds per minute, and they gauge how quickly the echoes return back to them, and they're able to build up a picture of their environment using their sound and the echoes. And the interesting thing about the sounds that the bats are making are that they are inaudible to us humans. When they're echolocating, the sounds that they're making, we can't actually hear them. So how do we do bat surveys? Well, we have to use devices called bat detectors, and very simply, a bat detector is a piece of equipment that has a microphone. It picks up the sound of the passing bat and it translates it into a sound that we humans can actually hear. A typical human can't hear noises above about 20 kilohertz. Well, most of our bats are calling well above that, typically around the 40 to 50 kilohertz mark, so it's well beyond the range of human hearing. All bat species in Ireland are protected by both Irish law under our Wildlife Acts and also protected under European Union law under the Habitats Directive. And because they've got this high level of protection, it is an offence to, for instance, to disturb or destroy a known bat roost. And the reason why bats are so highly protected is because they're animals, they're very habitual animals, and over time they build up a picture of their landscape. So if we are degrading the landscape, for example removing hedgerows and tree lines, we're actually interfering with the way the bats move around the countryside, and that has an impact on them finding their feeding grounds and being able to return back to their roosts. And also as well, bats generally only produce one young per annum. So if there is a negative impact on a local bat population for whatever reason, it takes quite a while for the population to recover back to its former levels. Another reason why bats are protected is because they have lost many of their traditional roosting sites. Bats traditionally used old farm buildings and older structures for roosts, but with modernisation and building renovation and works to bridges, etc., many of the roost sites were lost. So it's very important today that when we are actually demolishing or renovating older buildings, that we do factor in the potential presence of bats, and indeed we should be encouraging bats to use our buildings as well. Another interesting thing about bats and their roosts is that they use a number of different types of roost settings throughout the year. Now in Ireland, many of our roosts are found in buildings, but they will also occupy old stone bridges and indeed trees, particularly large mature trees with cracks and splits that allow the bats to get inside the tree. And this time of year, if you've got bats in your attic space, in your house or workplace, there's a high chance that it's actually what we call a maternity roost. So it's a roost of bats made up of a number of females that have come together to give birth to their young. And as I said, they only give birth generally to one young bat, which we call a pup. And this time of year, the young pups are born usually around July, and by the time the end of August comes around, the young bat is capable of independent flight, and then around September the roost will move on to a more transitional roost before they find their winter hibernating roost. So to track bats can actually be quite challenging because, as I say, they move around the landscape using different roosts throughout the year depending on their requirements. So what do bats eat? Well, all our Irish species are insectivores, so they're out hunting for insects and bugs. And indeed, one of our species, the pipistrelle, a well-known fact about it is that it can eat up to 2,000 to 3,000 midges a night. So when they're out, they spend a lot of their time feeding, because, you know, bats are flying around, they're extremely small and light, so they require a high energy input, so they have to eat for several hours each night. Moth species as well are a favourite of some species of bat, particularly the brown long-eared bat. Now, I mentioned earlier that bats evolved to occupy the nocturnal niche, and one of the strategies behind that is to avoid predation. However, bats do occasionally get predated by birds of prey, and when bats are returning to the roost around dawn time, any late stragglers are often picked off by a sparrowhawk or a barn owl as well, so they do actually have predators. When bats emerge from their roost, their first priority is to feed, and they travel to their feeding areas or commute to their feeding areas, and this is where linear features such as hedgerows and tree lines are very important, because the bats build up a map of their landscape and they tend to use the same hedgerow, the same tree line to move between their roost area and their feeding area. And that's why the whole issue of retaining our hedgerows, retaining our tree lines are so important, because if we go along and remove a large section of hedgerow, the bats become disorientated, and it can have quite a severe impact on a local bat population, because it will take the bats time to, I suppose, get more acquainted with the new landscape. So it's important that we do keep our tree lines and our hedgerows intact. How do we know if bats are using our loft space? Well, obviously you may actually encounter the bats if you are up in your attic, or you may notice them emerging at twilight. Quite often people don't realise they have bats in their attic space. One good clue is that if you come across bat droppings. Now, bat droppings look a lot like rodent droppings. However, if you put on a glove and pick up one of these droppings and squeeze it between your thumb and your finger, and if it crumbles very easily, it's likely that you've got bats in your attic. Now, the important thing about to remember if you do have bats in your attic is to be aware that bats are protected species and their roosts are also protected under Irish and European law. So the best place to go for advice is to the National Parks and Wildlife Service, or indeed organisations such as Bat Conservation Ireland. Now, when we come across bats in houses that are occupied, the first course of action will be always to try to encourage the people to accept that they've got bats in their attic space. And the thing to remember about bats are they're not rodents, so they're not going to be there chewing wires or electrical cables and causing damage in the loft space. And secondly, they're not bringing in nesting material to build nests. They don't require nests. All they require is some exposed rough timber on which to cling, and the heat of the roof, particularly in the summertime, is enough to keep them warm. So because we've lost so many of our traditional buildings and older structures, bat populations have come under pressure. So when we do get a confirmation of a bat roost in a building or a house or a workplace building, we'll always try and encourage the occupants to live alongside with the bats. Okay, so we're here by the Earn Shannon waterway again, and it's beginning to get dark. It's just coming up to sunset now, so bats typically emerge just at or shortly after sunset. So just before we start actually using the detectors to pick up whatever activity is around, just a very brief few words about detectors. I mean, there's lots of different types of model of detectors, some very basic ones, some very high-tech ones, but at the end of the day their function is to convert the ultrasound that the bats produce into a sound that's audible for humans to hear the bats. So hopefully when we get some bat activity later on, we'll be able to pick up the sounds that this is producing. And picking up the sounds is actually very important, because when we hear the bats, the sounds that are being made, we're able to identify fairly accurately in the field what species of bat is flying by. So I'm expecting to pick up pipistrelle species here this evening. So on the detector I'll be tuning in around the 45 kilohertz to the 55 kilohertz, and that will give me a reasonably good identification of the species. This particular detector here is a little bit more advanced, and not only does it convert the sounds into an audible one for us to hear, but it also produces sonograms on the screen here as well, and that can help to aid identification in the field. And of course, bat detectors can be plugged into your computer, and you can use software that can help to analyse and confirm your identifications. With practice, you become familiar with the noises and the rhythms of the different bat sounds that you're picking up. However, as I said, bat identification can be quite tricky, and sometimes it does take the aid of other expertise and indeed computer software to analyse the calls. However, for the more common species such as the pipistrelles, the general rule of thumb is that if you tune your detector into around 45 kilohertz, you will pick up pipistrelles. So the common pipistrelle is usually strongest at around 45 kilohertz, and the soprano pipistrelle is stronger at around 55 kilohertz. Okay, that was a soprano pipistrelle, Pipistrellus pygmaeus, and it's probably our most common and widespread bat species. It's one you're nearly guaranteed to pick up on a night out when you're doing your bat surveys. And the interesting thing about the soprano pipistrelle, now by the way, was picking him up stronger on a frequency of 55 kilohertz. There, you can get it there now, very strong there at 55. And the interesting thing about the soprano pipistrelle is that its counterpart, the common pipistrelle, which is picked up stronger at 45 kilohertz, they were only separated as two different species as recently as the 1990s. And it got the name soprano pipistrelle because of the fact that it's picked up strongest at 55 on a higher frequency than the common pipistrelle down at 45. So as I say, both pipistrelle species are very common and widespread in Ireland. So some nice calls there now coming in, some very strong calls there. And the bat now at the moment, it's not long after coming out of its roost, so it's busying itself feeding, and it'll feed for the next hour or so, and the diet will be lots of midges and other airborne insects and bugs, and of course over the water here like that there's an abundance of prey this evening. And it's ideal conditions for bats this evening. It's cloudy, dry, and importantly there's no breeze as well, and the temperature is about 17 degrees, so a perfect evening for bat watching.